Good morning. My name's Juliette Mendelovits. I wasn't here at your first meeting, unfortunately. I work for the Australian Council for Educational Research, and for 3 years I was based in our UK office in London, and I was responsible for putting together the bid that was awarded the contract to deliver the SNSA for Scotland, and I was there for the first 2 years of implementation of the program as the project director for ACER, but I have recently returned to Australia to my old role as one of the research directors for the company at large, but I still have a very intimate connection with my colleagues in the UK, with Helen and others, and I'm very happy to be able to be here today to share with you my thoughts about the SNSA and P1. I've been given the brief of talking about the connection between the SNSA P1 assessment and the benchmarks, and I want to spend most of my time on that, but I actually would like to talk a little bit first about the relationship between the SNSA and play-based learning. So I'm going to skip to the end of my slides, so bear with me for a minute, if I can get it to go through, because that's what we've just been talking about, so I think that's probably a better way to start. Okay, so look, I have to say from the outset that I'm not an expert on Froebelian pedagogy or play-based learning by any means, but I do have some acquaintance with it, and I'd just like to talk a little bit about what some of the connections are between SNSA and a play-based curriculum. I think in my understanding of play-based learning or learning through play, it's not the same as free play. It's play for learning or learning through play. So the educational aspect is obviously very, very important. It's not just, and I'm sure that Lynn would agree with this, it's not just about letting kids do exactly as they choose, however much one respects their autonomy and self-direction and so on. So one of the documents that I've been looking at is the LEGO Foundation's attempt to define characteristics of what they call learning through play, which is, I think, synonymous with learning through play, or with play-based learning rather. And they've defined 5 key characteristics. So learning through play is meaningful, socially interactive, actively engaging, iterative, and joyful. And in their further discussion, this is a research-based definition and framework. It's not as though every aspect of every kind of activity in play-based learning is going to have all of those characteristics, but those characteristics should underpin a play-based learning curriculum and approach. And one other area that I think isn't really so well articulated in the LEGO Foundation's definitions is the role of learner choice, learner voice and learner agency. So the autonomy that Lynn was talking about as well is a really key part of learning through play, one of the aims and also one of the methods of play-based learning. So I just thought it might be useful to have a look at how features of the SNSA align with those characteristics. SNSA was not designed as a play-based learning activity, clearly. It's not that, and we shouldn't pretend that it is, but it should be able to not contradict or subvert the aims of play-based learning, which is one of the fundamentals of the curriculum for excellence, as we know. So I'm just trying to look at a map of how these things fit together. So in terms of meaningfulness, well, the content is literacy and numeracy, and it would be surprising if children entering school didn't feel as though they needed to learn to read and write. It's sort of part of, and to do maths or sums or numeracy. It's sort of part of the idea of people have of being educated. So so as far as the SNSA is about literacy and numeracy, it ought to appear to be meaningful to little children as well as to older children. We've tried to create an assessment where the questions are contextualised with stories, with pictures, with scenarios, so that there's a meaningful context in which the children are approaching the questions. Socially interactive, well, children are expected to, does that matter? Later?
Keep going, I'll
Yeah, okay, whoops. You're still there? Yes, okay, thanks. it's not in itself a socially interactive activity. The children are expected to work through the assessment pretty much independently, although there are choices. You could have a one-to-one guidance with the teacher, or you could be sitting in a small group with other children doing the same activity, but it's not of itself a socially interactive activity. That's the way it is. Because we want to find out where each child is in their learning without other children or teachers helping them to answer the questions. Actively engaging, well, the aim is that the learner has control to an extent. They can work through the assessment at their own pace. I think this is an important distinguishing feature between this assessment and some other assessments that you might have come across, standardised assessments, where there's a timeout on individual questions, there's a timeout for the whole test. If you stop, that's the end of it, and so on. Where the SNSA has been designed so that children can take it at their own pace within the constraints of classroom management. A child can take as long as they need to take to do as well as they can, and that's been a kind of something that we've been keen to promote as something that gives the child some agency in working through the assessment. As you know, children can, if they're having trouble sitting still, they can get up and go away and do something else and come back, and they'll pick up the assessment at the point where they left off, whether it's a few minutes later or a few hours later or the next day, later in the year. All those freedoms are there within what the teacher can manage. Iterative, that encapsulates that idea that Lynn was talking about, is where error is not seen as a problem, but it's part of the learning and the play process. So children can make mistakes and then they learn through making the mistakes and correcting them and going on to bigger and better things. I can't say that SNSA assessment is iterative. In fact, children work through the assessments. Once they've finished a question, they move on to the next one and they can't go back. But as I said at the beginning, not every feature of every activity in play-based learning needs to address all of these activities. Finally, the joyful part of it. I don't know whether children are jumping up and down with glee at doing the assessment, but we've tried to make it as engaging as we can with, as I said, pictures and Alison guiding the children through the assessment. There's kind of an avatar kind of connection, and we hear that some children actually really like Alison and want to see more of her. So there are elements, we hope, of engagingness and pleasure and fun in doing the assessment, even if it's not an ecstatic experience. Finally, learner choice, voice and agency. It's a standardised assessment and there's a set pathway through it, so the agency is limited, but we are attempting, as David mentioned, to get feedback from learners, so we have the learner voice as a component of developing the assessment and improving it. And he mentioned there's just one single question at the end of the assessment for all P1 learners, which some of you might have seen already, but in case you haven't, this is what it looks like. So it's just a single question, it's voiced. So Alison asked the children, I'm finding it very hard to read this, maybe I can read it here. We've now finished all the activities. Choose the face that shows how you feel about the activities, and they just click on happy or sad. So from that we're going to be able to gather good population notion of how children are feeling about the assessment. The questions for the higher year levels or year groups are a little bit more complicated, but this one we thought would be simple enough and direct enough to capture the basic impression of the children, how they're feeling about the assessment. So we're looking forward to seeing the results of those data. Okay, I'm going to skip back to the main thrust of this talk now. I've got way too many slides, I think, so I might be galloping. So I think when Helen talked to you last time, 5 minutes left, really. The fundamental purpose of assessment is to establish where learners are in their learning at the time of the assessment. And so it's not aimed to be a straitjacket or to set a target or a goal. It's where is the child? What can we learn about what the child's shown us from this assessment in helping them to achieve their next stages of learning? The guiding principles of the SNSA to assess children's capacity and elements of CSFE, literacy and numeracy, to provide formative information and to help inform teachers' judgments for their ACEL evaluations. So I just want to talk in a little bit more detail, if I can, about the elements of CFE literacy, particularly today. So you'll be familiar with that document, I'm sure, and the layout of it. For SNSA literacy, we really concentrated on just the reading reading strand, and in particular on tools for reading and understanding, analysing and evaluating. So those are the benchmark statements for tools for reading. And in our questions, we've aimed to address some of those statements insofar as we can within this standardised format. They're the tools for reading ones, and these are the understanding, analysing and evaluating ones. And in the construct we developed with the guidance of Education Scotland and the Scottish Government, we assigned kind of percentage targets for each of those areas. So quite a lot of weight on tools for reading and quite a lot of weight on understanding, analysing and evaluating, and just a little bit on finding and using information. I'm hoping to show you a few items from tools for reading and understanding, using and evaluating, and show you the connection between the questions and the benchmark statements. So this is one of the tools for reading items. The children they hear, choose the letter that makes the sound. They hear D, and then they have to click on one of the letters. That's the answers given there. So the benchmark statement that addresses is that one there. Here's and says the different single sounds made by letters. So it's kind of very closely connected, as you'll see. In the reporting, we have this descriptor. So that's what the child was able or was not able to do. Here's another more sophisticated tools for reading question. They hear, you remember the icon, the mouth icon means they click on it and they hear the voice saying, choose the picture that matches the word, and then they have to read the word rocket and then match it to the picture. Now there are actually two benchmark statements that match quite well with that, and we don't know exactly which strategy a child uses. The child might recognise the word rocket because they've seen it, so they'll go straight for it, or they might have to sound it out. We don't know. So there are actually two statements that we're addressing possibly there. And then in the report, this would be the descriptor that the teacher would see. Match a picture to a multi-syllable word without audio support. Thank you. Now turning to understanding, analysing and evaluating, here's an example of one of the questions that the P1 child might see. They have to read the sentence themselves, it's not voiced, and then they're asked with the voice which child went shopping. The benchmark statement that one addresses is this one. Asks or answers questions about events and ideas in a text, a very broad statement. So it's quite a complicated sentence. So it requires a fair degree of reading skill to be able to answer that one. And the description in the reports says this about the item, interprets information in a complex sentence. And finally, here's one of the stories. Now, as you probably know, there are a number of different ways of presenting stories in the SNSA. Some are very, very short, might just be on a page, might be a tiny little story that's voiced, so the child can listen. It's really about listening comprehension, which is, as you know, is one of the really important precursors for reading comprehension. Sometimes a very short story has to be decoded by the child, read by the child. Then we've got longer stories like this one, which has got 4 pages, but it's all voiced. So the child, if they're not yet able to decode and read, they can just listen to the story and take in the meaning from listening, and then answer the questions, which are also all voiced. And at the most advanced level, children need to read the story themselves independently and answer questions with voice or without. So the whole range of different approaches to comprehension in the assessment, and depending on how the child's performing, they'll get the more or less demanding time. I think there was a question last time Helen told me about why so many children got to Hummingbird, which was really quite a sophisticated and advanced piece of reading. And that was partly because we, to an extent, made the assessment a little bit too easy, and so children who were looked as though they were doing very well on the test, actually on the assessment, got to those more advanced reading questions. But and still, some of those children did quite well on that text, despite that. So, just one more item here. For this one, the child can listen to the story. This is on the first page, and then answer the question again. It's all voiced, so all they need to do is listen and understand language to be able to answer this question. The benchmark that this addresses is this one. Engages with text read to them, and again it's a double whammy one, answers questions about ideas and events in a text. And in the report that appears like that as a descriptor. So the idea is that these descriptors are closely related to the questions, they're also related to the benchmarks, and the information the teacher gets back should give an idea of what the child is able to do and is not able to do. I'm sure I've run out of time now. Can I keep going? No?
Yeah, no. How much more have you got to do?
Oh, 5 minutes?
Yeah, have 3.
All right, I'll try and speed it. And I think Helen showed you this chart last time, which shows the different year groups and how the long scale works across year groups. So the green ones are the reading ones, and that circle there represents the 5 bands, 6 bands. Bands 1 to 6 of the reading scale are addressed in the P1 assessment. So it's part of a long continuum that goes up to band 12. Looking more closely at that, we can see how these 4 items that I've just shown you range across those year groups. You probably had an impression as you were looking at them of how difficult or how easy they were. Well, that first one with the, which sound is this, that's at level 1, and then we've got a couple of them at level 4 and one at level 5. So we're covering a range of difficulty determined by not something that we've invented, but actually what percentage of children are able to do these items. A child who saw those 4 items would have been going through a pathway along the assessment like this. So they did not so well on the first cluster and then went to cluster C, which is for the children who weren't going so well. And then the child did well on cluster C, they've gone back to a more difficult cluster at E. And a child going along that pathway would have seen those 4 items, and those 4 items will appear in that child's report, and you'll be able to see whether they were able to do those items or not. So this is what it looks like. I won't run. This is the first page of the individual report with the child's overall performance. This is the last page where you can see how they did in their class and school and against the national norm. And then the more important diagnostic area is the middle page, page 2, which shows each item as a descriptor within its organiser, tools for reading, finding, using information, or understanding and analysing and evaluating. So if we look at the tools for reading part, here are all the tools for reading items that child saw, and you can see that first item, that's the one right down the bottom there, and the child got that one correct. And the second one, the more difficult one, that was level 4. Child didn't succeed on that one. So that child's actually following quite a typical pattern. And you can see where the child's difficulties might arise, even though they were able to do that first item about a single syllable, single phoneme, they're not yet mastering the digraphs at the top. So this gives you kind of a profile of where the child's learning is at the time when they took the test. Similarly, if we look at the understanding, analysing and evaluating questions that the child saw, that one from the little listening comprehension story, that's sitting around the middle there, and they did fine in that one. The other one, which was a shorter text, but they had to read it independently, they weren't yet able to do. So you can see that there's a progression in the child's learning that's being mapped through the assessment. So that's really how we've related the Curriculum for Excellence benchmarks to the assessment. Every item is addressing one of the benchmarks, and we're attempting to explain in the descriptors in a little bit more fine-grained detail exactly what the child has been able to do or not. That's all I've got to say.